Sometimes the most broken people have the biggest hearts. Sometimes those society overlooks are the ones who see the most clearly. Hank Miller knew this truth as he sat in his wheelchair outside the city clinic that cold December morning, watching. His breath formed small clouds in the winter air. The 58-year-old veteran had learned to make himself invisible. People looked through him like he didn't exist. But when he spotted a tiny girl curled against the concrete steps, wearing nothing but a thin shirt, everything changed. Her lips were blue from the cold. Her small body shivered against the frost-covered ground. While busy people walked past, checking their phones, Hank rolled his wheelchair over and gently lifted the child into his arms. He pushed through the clinic doors and called for help, not knowing that this single act of compassion would turn his forgotten life upside down. What he discovered about this abandoned little girl would break his heart, but what others discovered about him would surprise everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other for Hank Miller. He'd awakened before dawn in the doorway of Murphy's hardware store, his sleeping bag damp with frost, the familiar ache in his missing legs a sharp reminder of how far he'd fallen. The phantom pain never truly left, a cruel joke from a body that remembered limbs blown apart by an improvised explosive device on a dusty road outside Kandahar 15 years ago. He folded his sleeping bag with practiced efficiency, the same methodical movements he'd learned in the army. Sergeant First Class Henry Hank Miller had once commanded respect, led men through impossible missions, earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. Now he commanded nothing but a worn wheelchair and a backpack containing everything he owned in the world. The faded photograph tucked inside his wallet showed a different man, younger, whole, surrounded by his unit before that final patrol. 8 men had gone out that morning. Only 4 came home. Of those 4, Hank sometimes wondered if he'd truly made it back at all. The explosion had taken more than his legs. It had shattered his marriage, his career, his sense of purpose. His wife couldn't handle the nightmares, the drinking, the angry silences. His son Marcus had been 12 when Hank came home broken. By the time Marcus turned 18, he'd stopped trying to connect with a father who seemed to exist behind an invisible wall. Now Marcus was gone too, lost to the streets and heroin 3 years ago. Hank had heard about his son's death through a social worker who'd tracked him down at the shelter. No funeral, no goodbye, just another casualty of a war that kept claiming victims long after the shooting stopped. The city was waking up around him as Hank propelled his wheelchair down the cracked sidewalk. Early commuters hurried past, eyes fixed on their phones, coffee cups steaming in the December cold. They moved around him like water around a stone, their peripheral vision somehow missing the man who'd once defended their freedom. It wasn't malicious, just the practiced blindness city dwellers developed toward life's harsh realities. Hank understood their avoidance. He'd become part of the urban furniture, as permanent and forgettable as fire hydrants and street signs. Some days he felt like a ghost haunting his own life, visible only when someone needed to complain about his presence or move him along. The wheelchair's worn wheels squeaked as he navigated around construction barriers and parked cars. His upper body had grown strong over the years, shoulders and arms compensating for what he'd lost below the waist. The military discipline remained, straight posture, alert eyes, scanning for threats or opportunities. Old habits died hard, even when everything else about a man had died already. He'd been heading to the community clinic that morning, not for any specific ailment, but for the warmth. The clinic's waiting area stayed heated, and the security guard, a fellow veteran named Joe, usually let him sit there for a few hours before anyone complained. Joe understood the unspoken brotherhood between soldiers, the way shared trauma created bonds that civilian life couldn't break. Dr. Sarah Chen ran the clinic with the kind of quiet competence Hank respected. She'd been trained at prestigious hospitals, but chose to work in this underfunded neighborhood facility, treating everyone who walked through her doors regardless of their ability to pay. Hank had observed her interactions with other homeless patients, never condescending, never rushed, treating each person with the dignity the world often denied them. Nurse Janet Morrison was different. She'd worked at the clinic for 20 years and developed the hard shell many healthcare workers wore to protect themselves from endless human suffering. She followed protocols, enforced rules, and viewed homeless patients as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. Hank didn't blame her. Burnout was an occupational hazard in places like this. The morning air bit through his threadbare jacket as he approached the clinic. The building was a converted warehouse, its brick facade painted institutional green, windows barred against break-ins. A sign by the entrance listed operating hours and services available. Hank knew the schedule by heart. Doors opened at 8, closed at 4, lunch break from noon to 1 when everyone was locked out regardless of their condition. Other familiar faces dotted the street, fellow travelers on the margins of society. There was Rosa, the elderly woman who collected cans and spoke to herself in Spanish, carrying on animated conversations with people only she could see. Tommy, the young man whose mental illness had cost him his job and apartment, now living in cardboard shelters and fighting invisible enemies. Sarah, the teenage girl who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go, trying to finish high school while sleeping in bus stations. They formed an informal community, looking out for each other in small ways, sharing information about meal times at shelters, warning about police sweeps, offering companionship in a world that preferred to pretend they didn't exist. Hank had learned their stories over months and years of chance encounters, recognizing the common threads of trauma, abandonment, and systems that had failed them when they needed help most. His military training had taught him to assess situations quickly, identify threats and opportunities. The skills translated well to street life, where survival depended on reading people's intentions, knowing which alleys were safe, understanding the complex social dynamics of shelters and soup kitchens. He'd learned to project an aura of quiet, dignity that earned him respect from both the homeless community and the social workers who occasionally tried to help. The wheelchair reached the clinic steps just as the morning sun crested the buildings, casting long shadows across the concrete. Hank positioned himself near the entrance, close enough to benefit from the building's residual heat, but not blocking the doorway where he might be asked to move. He'd perfected this delicate balance, visible enough to be helped if someone chose. Kindness, invisible enough to avoid confrontation. His backpack contained everything that mattered: the photograph of his unit, his discharge papers, a Purple Heart medal he'd never shown anyone, a few changes of clothes, basic toiletries, and a journal where he wrote letters to Marcus he'd never send. The letters were conversations with a ghost, attempts to bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become, between the father he'd failed to be and the man he was trying to remain. The dog tags around his neck stayed hidden beneath his shirt, the metal worn smooth by 15 years of unconscious touching. They were the last tangible link to the man he'd been before the explosion, before everything fell apart. Sometimes he considered throwing them away, cutting that final connection to a life that felt like someone else's memory. But he couldn't quite let go. They were proof that he'd once mattered, once served something larger than himself. As he waited for the clinic to open, Hank watched the city come alive around him. Office workers clutched their coffee cups like lifelines. Delivery trucks rumbled past. Early shoppers emerged from the subway station across the street. All of them had destinations, purposes, people who expected them somewhere. He envied that certainty, that sense of belonging to the world's machinery. The morning felt different somehow, charged with possibility he couldn't quite name. Later, he would remember this moment, the quiet before everything changed, when he was still just another invisible man waiting for warmth, He would remember the weight of his past, the emptiness of his present, and the complete absence of hope for his future. He had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, a small child would transform him from observer to participant, from forgotten to essential. He couldn't imagine that his most heroic act lay ahead of him, or that the family he thought he'd lost forever was about to return in the most unexpected way. The soft whimpering sound almost didn't register above the morning traffic. Hank's trained ear, honed by years of military service and street survival, caught the subtle noise that others missed. He turned his wheelchair toward the sound, scanning the clinic's entrance with the methodical attention to detail that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. There, tucked against the concrete steps like a discarded doll, was a child. The sight hit him like a physical blow. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, curled in a tight ball with her knees drawn to her chest. Her dark hair was matted, her clothes a thin pink t-shirt and stained leggings, completely inadequate for the December cold. Her lips had a blue tinge that made Hank's stomach clench with recognition. He'd seen hypothermia before, in soldiers and civilians alike. The child was in serious danger. A torn hospital bracelet hung loosely around her tiny wrist, the plastic weathered and partially illegible. Hank could make out what looked like Emma and some numbers, but the rest had worn away. How long had she been here? How had dozens of people walked past without seeing her? But even as the question formed, Hank knew the answer. People saw what they expected to see, and they didn't expect to find abandoned children on clinic steps. The human mind was remarkably good at filtering out information that didn't fit comfortable assumptions about how the world worked. Emma, if that was indeed her name, stirred slightly, her small body shaking with cold. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible. Hank felt the familiar surge of adrenaline he'd experienced before combat missions, the sharp focus that came when lives hung in the balance. This was no time for hesitation or doubt. He propelled his wheelchair closer, wincing as the movement caused Emma to flinch. Her eyes opened, large, dark, and filled with the kind of wariness that no child should ever possess. She didn't cry or call out, which somehow made the situation even more heartbreaking. This was a child who had learned not to expect help, not to trust that adults would protect her. "Hey there, sweetheart," Hank said softly, using the gentle voice he'd once reserved for bedtime stories with Marcus. "My name is Hank. You look cold." Emma's eyes tracked his movement, but she remained motionless, watching him with the calculating gaze of someone far older than her years. Hank had seen that look before, in refugee children, in abuse victims, in anyone who had learned that survival meant constant vigilance. Moving slowly to avoid startling her, Hank shrugged out of his jacket. It wasn't much, a worn military surplus, coat that had seen better years, but it was warm from his body heat and would provide some protection against the cold. He leaned forward as far as his wheelchair allowed and gently draped the jacket over Emma's small form. The child's reaction was immediate and unexpected. Instead of pulling away, she reached up with tiny hands and grasped the jacket, pulling it tighter around herself. Her eyes remained fixed on Hank's face, searching for something, kindness perhaps, or simply the absence of threat. "That's better," Hank murmured. "Now, let's get you somewhere warm." The clinic doors were still locked. It was barely 7:30, 30 minutes before opening time, but Hank could see lights inside, staff arriving for the day. He began pounding on the glass doors, his palm making sharp slapping sounds that echoed off the building's facade. "Help!" he called out. "There's a child out here. She needs medical attention." A security guard appeared, not Joe, but a younger man Hank didn't recognize. The guard's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion as he took in the scene. A homeless veteran in a wheelchair, holding a small child wrapped in an oversized military jacket. "What's going on here?" the guard asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the radio on his belt. "Found her on the steps," Hank said, his voice tight with urgency. "She's hypothermic, needs help now." The guard hesitated, clearly unsure of protocol. Behind him, Hank could see Dr. Chen arriving, her medical bag in hand. She took one look at Emma and immediately stepped into action. "Open the door," she ordered the guard. "Now!" The lobby filled with controlled chaos as Dr. Chen called for Nurse Morrison and began her initial assessment. Emma clung to Hank's jacket, her small fingers twisted in the fabric as if it were the only solid thing in an unstable world. "Did you find her?" Dr. Chen asked, her hands gentle as she checked Emma's pulse and breathing. Just now, she was on the steps, barely conscious. Nurse Morrison appeared, her expression skeptical as she took in Hank's appearance. The homeless man, the military jacket, the child who seemed reluctant to be separated from him. "We need to call the police," Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional procedure and social services. This could be a child who needs immediate medical attention," Dr. Chen interrupted firmly. "Everything else comes second." But Morrison was already reaching for the phone, her movements sharp with suspicion. "Sir, I need you to step back from the child. Security." The situation deteriorated rapidly. The security guard moved toward Hank, his earlier uncertainty replaced by official authority. More staff appeared, drawn by the commotion. Voices rose in a cacophony of competing concerns, medical protocols, legal requirements, safety procedures. Through it all, Emma remained silent, her dark eyes moving from face to face with the wary alertness of prey animal. When the security guard tried to take her from Hank's arms, she made a sound, not quite a cry, but a whimper of distress that cut through the noise like a blade. "She doesn't want to go," Hank said, his voice steady. Despite the chaos around him, "Look at her, she's scared." "Sir, you need to release the child immediately," Morrison said, her tone brooking no argument. "We don't know who you are or what your intentions might be." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Hank felt the familiar sting of judgment, the assumption that his appearance and circumstances automatically made him a threat. He'd experienced it countless times. The crossed streets, the locked car doors, the suspicious glances that reduced him to a stereotype rather than a human being. But Emma's tiny hand found his thumb, wrapping around it with surprising strength. The simple gesture spoke louder than any words could. This child, who had every reason to fear adults, had chosen to trust him. In the world full of people who looked through him, she had seen something worth holding on to. Dr. Chen noticed the interaction, her medical training recognizing what others missed, the signs of a genuine bond forming between patient and caregiver. "Let him stay," she said quietly, "at least until we can assess her condition properly." The police arrived within minutes, their presence turning the clinic lobby into an official crime scene. Questions flew like accusations. How long had he known the child? Where were her parents? What was his relationship to her? Had he taken her from somewhere else? Hank answered each question with military precision, sticking to the facts, providing details about the timeline and his actions. But he could see the skepticism in their eyes, the way they positioned themselves between him and the exits. In their minds, he was already guilty of something. The only question was what. Emma submitted to the medical examination with the passive compliance of someone accustomed to having no control over what happened to her body. But her eyes kept returning to Hank, as if his presence was the only anchor in a storm of unfamiliar faces and procedures. The torn hospital bracelet told part of her story. She was Emma Rodriguez, age 3, and according to the partial medical information still visible, she had been a patient at the children's hospital across town. But how she'd ended up abandoned on the clinic steps remained a mystery that would require investigation to unravel. As the morning wore on, one truth became increasingly clear. Emma had chosen Hank as her protector, and despite all the suspicion and protocol, nothing anyone did could convince her to let go. The interrogation room at the police station smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Detective Maria Santos sat across from Hank, her notebook open, pen poised above a fresh page. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of controlled professionalism that came from years of dealing with society's difficult situations. "Tell me again about this morning," she said, her voice neither hostile nor friendly, just methodical. From the beginning, Hank had already recounted the story 3 times, but he understood the process. Repetition revealed inconsistencies, lies, hidden motives. He'd used similar techniques himself during his military service when questioning captured insurgents. "I arrived at the clinic around 7:15, he began, his voice steady. "I usually go there in the mornings. It's warm, and the security guard, Joe Martinez, he's a veteran too. He understands." Santos made a note. "But Joe Martinez wasn't working today." "No, different guard, younger guy. I'd never seen him before." "And you found the child on the steps." "Emma. Her name is Emma, according to the bracelet." Hank reached into his backpack, pulling out his worn wallet. From it, he extracted his military discharge papers, his Purple Heart citation, and a faded photograph of men in combat gear. "I'm not a threat, detective. I'm just a soldier who came home broken." Santos examined the documents, her expression softening almost imperceptibly as she read the citations. 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, 15 years of honorable service, ending with medical discharge due to combat injuries. The photograph showed a younger Hank surrounded by his unit, men who looked invincible in their desert camouflage before the war taught them otherwise. "Afghanistan?" she asked. 2 tours. "Lost my legs to an IED outside Kandahar in 2009. Hank's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone veterans used when discussing their wounds, clinical, distant, as if describing someone else's tragedy. The detective's demeanor shifted subtly. Her father had served in Vietnam, came home with his own invisible scars. She understood how war could hollow out a man, leaving him technically alive but fundamentally changed. "The staff at the clinic seemed concerned about your interaction with the child," Santos said carefully. "Nurse Morrison felt that I was a threat because I'm homeless." Hank finished the sentence with weary acceptance. "I understand their caution, detective. But that little girl was dying. If I hadn't found her, if I hadn't gotten her inside—" "The medical report confirms hypothermia," Santos acknowledged. "Dr. Chen believes another hour in those conditions could have been fatal." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. A uniformed officer entered, carrying a file folder and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something significant. "Detective, we got the preliminary results from social services. The child was reported missing from the Children's Hospital 4 days ago. Emma Rodriguez, age 3, was being treated for malnutrition and developmental delays consistent with neglect. Her mother, 17-year-old Jessica Torres, brought her in but disappeared during the night. Hospital security footage shows Torres leaving around 2 a.m., but no footage of her taking the child." Santos absorbed this information, her pen moving rapidly across the notebook. "So Emma was abandoned at the hospital?" "That's what it looks like. Staff assumed the mother was coming back. Sometimes families get overwhelmed, need a break. By the time they realized Torres wasn't returning, Emma had somehow left the building too. No one knows how she ended up across town at the clinic." Hank felt something cold settle in his chest. A 3-year-old child, abandoned by her teenage mother, somehow wandering the streets for 4 days before collapsing on clinic steps. The cruelty of it was staggering, even by the harsh standards of life he'd witnessed both in war and on the streets. "Has anyone located the mother?" he asked. Santos looked at him with something approaching respect. Most people in his position would be focused on their own legal jeopardy, not the welfare of a child they'd just met. "We're working on it. Torres is a minor herself, no fixed address, history of drug use. The child's father is unknown." She closed her notebook. "Mr. Miller, I have to ask, do you have any connection to this family? Any reason you might have known the child before today?" "No. Never seen her before in my life." The words came easily because they were true, but something nagged at Hank. A familiar quality to Emma's features he couldn't quite place. "Detective, what's going to happen to her?" "Emergency foster placement. While we investigate. The state has protocols for these situations." The thought of Emma being shuffled into another institutional setting made Hank's chest tighten. He'd seen enough of how systems treated the vulnerable to know that protocols often meant more bureaucracy than compassion. Back at the clinic, Dr. Chen was conducting a thorough examination of Emma, documenting every sign of neglect and abuse. For the inevitable court proceedings, the child submitted to the medical tests with disturbing passivity, as if she'd learned that resistance was futile. "Her developmental delays are significant," Dr. Chen explained to the social worker who had arrived to take custody. "Speech is minimal, motor skills are delayed, clear signs of malnutrition over an extended period. She's going to need specialized care." Emma sat on the examination table in a hospital gown, her tiny legs dangling over the edge. Her dark eyes continued to search for Hank, even though he was still at the police station. In her small hand, she clutched the corner of his military jacket, which no one had the heart to take away from her. Nurse Morrison watched the scene with the professional detachment that helped her survive working in an underfunded clinic where tragedies were routine. But even she was moved by the child's obvious distress at being separated from the homeless man who had saved her life. "She keeps asking for Hank," Dr. Chen noted. "It's one of the few clear words she's spoken. She's formed an attachment." The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Williams, who had seen too many cases like this, sighed as she filled out forms. "Attachment disorders are common in neglected children. They'll bond with anyone who shows them kindness. It's not necessarily significant." But Dr. Chen wasn't convinced. She'd worked with enough traumatized children to recognize the difference between generic attachment and genuine connection. Emma's response to Hank had been immediate and specific. She'd chosen him as her protector among all the adults who had tried to help her. When the social worker prepared to transfer Emma to temporary foster care, the child's distress became more pronounced. She began to cry, not the demanding wail of a normal 3-year-old, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of someone who had learned that crying didn't bring rescue. "Where is Hank?" she asked, the words barely intelligible through her tears. "I want Hank." Dr. Chen made a decision that would later prove pivotal. She called Detective Santos and requested that Hank be allowed to return to the clinic to say goodbye to Emma. It was an unusual request, given the investigation, but Santos agreed, partly out of compassion, and partly because she was beginning to suspect that this homeless veteran was exactly what he appeared to be, a broken man who had found purpose in protecting a vulnerable child. When Hank returned to the clinic, still under police supervision, Emma's transformation was immediate. Her tears stopped, her body relaxed, and for the first time since the morning's chaos began, she smiled, a small, tentative expression that lit up her entire face. The temporary foster home was a well-meaning disaster. Emma had been placed with the Hendersons, an older couple who had fostered dozens of children over the years. They knew all the procedures, had attended all the training sessions, understood the importance of structure and routine for traumatized children. What they didn't understand was why this particular child sat by their living room window for hours, watching the street with the patience of someone waiting for a miracle. "She won't eat," Mrs. Henderson reported to the social worker during the required check-in call. "Just picks at her food, and she keeps asking for someone named Hank. We've tried explaining that he was just a stranger who helped her, but she doesn't seem to understand." Patricia Williams, the social worker, made notes in Emma's file. 3 days in foster care, and the child was exhibiting classic signs of traumatic separation: refusing food, minimal speech, withdrawal from social interaction. It wasn't unusual, but it was concerning. "Has she shown any interest in toys? Other children?" "No, she just sits with that old military jacket wrapped around her. We tried to wash it, but she screamed until we gave it back. It smells terrible, but let her keep it for now. Sometimes children need transitional objects to feel secure. What the social worker didn't say was that she'd never seen a child form such a strong attachment to someone they'd just met. In her 15 years of child welfare work, Williams had witnessed every variation of trauma response, but Emma's fixation on Hank Miller was unprecedented. Meanwhile, Hank was experiencing his own form of separation anxiety. He found himself returning to the clinic daily, not for warmth or medical attention, but because it was the place where Emma had trusted him. Dr. Chen had noticed his regular presence and gradually begun including him in conversations about the case. "She's not thriving in foster care," Dr. Chen reported during one of these informal discussions. "The Hendersons are good people, but Emma's not bonding with them. She's losing weight, barely speaking. The trauma specialists are concerned." Hank absorbed this information with the stoic expression that had become his default response to life's cruelties. But inside, something was breaking apart. He'd spent years believing he had nothing left to offer the world, that his usefulness had died in that Afghan desert along with his legs and his sense of purpose. Emma's trust had awakened something he'd thought was gone forever. The need to protect, to matter, to be essential to another human being's survival. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, hating the helplessness in his own voice. Dr. Chen studied his face, seeing past the homeless veteran exterior to the man underneath. Scarred, but not broken. Diminished, but not destroyed. The social worker mentioned that supervised visits might be possible, if you're interested. The first visit took place in a sterile conference room at the Department of Social Services. Emma entered with Mrs. Henderson, her small hand clutching the military jacket that had become her security blanket. When she saw Hank waiting in his wheelchair, her entire body seemed to come alive. "Hank!" she cried, the word clear and joyful as she ran toward him. The reunion was awkward under the watchful eyes of the social worker and foster mother, but Emma's happiness was undeniable. She climbed onto Hank's lap with the confidence of a child who had found her safe harbor, chattering in her limited vocabulary about things only she understood. Hank listened patiently, responding to her nonsensical stories with the kind of focused attention most adults reserve for important business meetings. He didn't try to correct her grammar or push her to make sense. He simply accepted her communication as valuable, worthy of respect. "Tell me about the bunny," he said, noticing the small, stuffed rabbit clutched in her other hand, the only possession she'd had when found on the clinic steps. Emma launched into an elaborate explanation involving the bunny's adventures, her words tumbling together in a mixture of English and sounds that served as her private language. Hank nodded seriously, asking questions that encouraged her to continue. Patricia Williams watched this interaction with growing amazement. The withdrawn, silent child who had been worrying everyone was transformed in Hank's presence, animated, engaged, clearly happy for the first time since entering care. "Mr. Miller," Williams said during a private moment while Emma played with toys in the corner, "I have to ask, do you have any experience with children? Your interaction with Emma is remarkable." Hank's expression darkened. "I had a son. Lost him to the streets 3 years ago. Overdose." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, but Williams caught the grief underneath. "I'm sorry. Marcus was 12 when I came back from Afghanistan. I wasn't—" Hank paused, struggling with memories he rarely allowed himself to examine. "I wasn't a good father after the war. The nightmares, the drinking, the anger. I pushed everyone away. My wife left, took Marcus with her. By the time I got sober, he was already using drugs. I tried to help him, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. But Williams understood. She'd seen countless families destroyed by the ripple effects of trauma, wars, addiction, mental illness, poverty. The casualties extended far beyond the initial victim. "Emma isn't your son," she said gently. "No, but maybe she's my second chance." The visits became a regular occurrence, twice weekly supervised meetings where Emma blossomed under Hank's attention. He brought her small gifts, a coloring book, crayons, a picture book about a brave little rabbit. Nothing expensive, but chosen, with care, and presented with ceremony that made them precious. More importantly, he brought consistency. While her world had become a series of temporary arrangements and unfamiliar faces, Hank was the constant who showed up exactly when promised, who remembered every detail of their previous conversations, who treated her words as important even when they didn't make complete sense. Dr. Chen began attending some of these visits, ostensibly to monitor Emma's progress, but increasingly because she was witnessing something extraordinary. The homeless veteran and the abandoned child were healing each other, filling needs that no amount of professional intervention had been able to address. "She's gained 3 pounds since the visit started," Dr. Chen noted in her medical report. "Her speech is improving, and she's beginning to engage with other adults when Hank is present. The attachment appears to be therapeutic rather than pathological. But the system wasn't designed to accommodate such unusual healing relationships. Foster care, adoption procedures, and child welfare protocols assume that professional caregivers and traditional families were always preferable to unconventional arrangements. The idea that a homeless man might be the key to a traumatized child's recovery challenged every assumption about what constituted appropriate care. Williams found herself in the uncomfortable position of advocating for something that had no precedent. In her experience, how do you explain to a judge that a child's best interests might be served by maintaining a relationship with someone who lived on the streets? How do you justify the emotional bond between a 3-year-old and a man whose own life was still in pieces? The answer, she was beginning to realize, might require thinking beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom, a prospect that both excited and terrified her. The local news story broke on a slow Tuesday evening when Channel 7's human interest reporter needed content to fill the broadcast. "Homeless veteran saves abandoned child" was exactly the kind of heartwarming story that balanced out the day's diet of political scandals and traffic accidents. The reporter, an ambitious young woman named Jessica Martinez, had gotten the tip from a clinic employee who thought the story deserved attention. What she found when she dug deeper was more complex than the simple hero narrative she'd expected to tell. "The question everyone's asking," Martinez reported from outside the Department of Social Services, "is whether this unusual bond between a homeless man and an abandoned child represents genuine care or something more troubling." While Hank Miller's military record is exemplary, his current circumstances raise concerns about his ability to provide appropriate guidance for a traumatized 3-year-old. The story included interviews with child development experts who spoke in careful, measured tones about attachment disorders and the vulnerability of neglected children. They used phrases like trauma bonding and inappropriate dependency, while sitting in sterile offices that had never witnessed the simple joy on Emma's face when she saw Hank. But the story also included Dr. Chen's perspective, and her words carried the weight of someone who had observed the relationship firsthand. "I've been practicing pediatric medicine for 15 years, she said, looking directly into the camera. "I've never seen a child respond to anyone the way Emma responds. To Mr. Miller, there's genuine love there, genuine healing. Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind struggles to understand." The broadcast was followed by a flood of phone calls to the Social Services Department, some supportive, others outraged. The comments section on the news station's website became a battleground between those who saw Hank as a hero and those who viewed him as a potential threat. "This man is homeless for a reason," wrote one commenter. "We don't let people living on the streets take care of our children, no matter how good their intentions. Maybe if we took better care of our veterans, they wouldn't be homeless in the first place," responded another. This man served his country and lost his legs defending our freedom. Now he's trying to save a child everyone else ignored. The attention brought unwelcome complications. Reporters began showing up at the clinic, asking staff and patients for quotes about Hank and Emma. The Department of Social Services received calls from advocacy groups on both sides of the issue. Veterans organizations demanding support for Hank, child welfare advocates expressing concern about Emma's placement. Detective Santos found herself fielding questions from her superiors about the ongoing investigation. The case had evolved from a simple child abandonment into something more complex, with public opinion and media attention influencing official decisions. "Have we located the mother yet?" her captain asked during the weekly case review. "Still working on it. Jessica Torres, 17, no permanent address. She's been living in various shelters and abandoned buildings. Drug history, but nothing violent. Street sources say she's been asking about her daughter, but she's too scared to come forward." Scared? Of what? Child endangerment charges. Abandonment. She's a minor herself, but old enough to face serious legal consequences. The captain leaned back in his chair, weighing the political implications of a case that had suddenly become very public. "What about the homeless guy? Any red flags?" Santos shook her head. "Hank Miller is exactly what he appears to be, a decorated combat veteran dealing with PTSD and physical disability. No criminal history, no complaints from other shelter residents or social service workers. The attachment between him and the child appears genuine, but he's homeless." "Yes, sir, but that might be changing." The media attention had triggered an unexpected response from the veterans community. Phone calls began pouring into the VA hospital, the local veterans service organizations, and the American Legion Post, where Hank had never been welcome before. Not because they didn't want him, but because he'd never asked for help. Tom Bradley, a Vietnam veteran who ran a local non-profit called Warriors Haven, was the first to reach out. He appeared at the clinic one morning carrying a business card and wearing the expression of a man who understood both duty and redemption. "Saw the news story," Bradley said without preamble, when he found Hank in his usual spot by the clinic. "Entrance, wanted to talk." Hank studied the older man, recognizing the military bearing that never quite left former soldiers. Bradley carried himself with the confidence of someone who had found purpose after war, who had translated his service into civilian mission. "I'm not looking for charity," Hank said carefully. "Not offering charity. Offering help. There's a difference." Bradley settled onto a nearby bench, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere until they'd talked. "You know about the Veteran Housing Voucher Program?" "Tried that. Waiting list is 3 years long. 3 years if you go through regular channels. Less than 3 months if you know who to call and you've got a Purple Heart with your paperwork." For the first time in years, Hank felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to impossible dreams, but the practical hope of someone who saw a genuine path forward. "Why now?" he asked. "I've been on the streets for years. Nobody cared before." Bradley's expression hardened. "People care, Miller. They just don't know how to help, and most veterans are too proud to ask. But that little girl, she changes the equation. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore." They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, paperwork that needed to be filed, benefits that Hank had never claimed, support services he'd never accessed. Bradley had connections throughout the veterans community, relationships built over decades of helping other former soldiers navigate the complex bureaucracy of civilian life. "The housing voucher gets you an apartment," Bradley explained. "But you're going to need more than that if you want to make a case for custody of that child. Employment, stability, support system. We can help with all of that, but you have to be willing to do the work." The word custody hung in the air between them like a bridge neither man was ready to cross. The idea that Hank might actually become Emma's guardian seemed both impossible and inevitable. Impossible given his circumstances, inevitable given their connection. I don't know if I'm capable of raising a child, Hank admitted. I failed. My own son. Marcus? Hank's head snapped up, surprised that Bradley knew the name. Small community. The Veterans Network. Word gets around when we lose someone. Your boy's overdose. That wasn't your fault, Miller. War changes men, and sometimes the people we love get caught in the fallout. Doesn't mean we can't learn from... It doesn't mean we can't do better next time. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who emerged from the clinic carrying Emma. It was time for her weekly visit with Hank, but today's meeting would be different. Bradley had arranged for it to take place at Warriors Haven, giving Emma a chance to see what stability might look like. The non-profit's offices were located in a converted warehouse, the same kind of industrial building that housed the clinic but transformed into something warmer, more hopeful. The walls displayed photographs of veterans who had successfully transitioned from homelessness to housing, from isolation to community. Emma explored the space with cautious curiosity, while Hank met with counselors who specialized in helping veterans access benefits and services. For the first time, he wasn't just a homeless man seeking temporary assistance, he was a potential father preparing to provide for his child. The transformation was subtle but profound. Hank's posture straightened, his voice gained confidence, his questions became more focused and forward-looking. He was remembering what it felt like to have purpose, to be working towards something larger than mere survival. When Emma tired of exploring, she climbed onto Hank's lap and nestled against his chest with the satisfied sigh of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. Watching them together, Bradley felt the familiar satisfaction that came from recognizing a mission accomplished. "She's going to need you to be better than you've ever been," he told Hank quietly. "I know, and you're going to need help to get there." "I know that too." It was the beginning of a plan that would test everything Hank thought he knew about redemption, responsibility, and the possibility that broken people could still build something beautiful from the pieces of their shattered lives. The letter arrived at Warriors Haven 3 weeks after the news story aired, delivered by a social worker who handled cases in the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. The envelope was water-stained and torn, the handwriting shaky, the paper thin and cheap, the kind of stationery found in homeless shelters and community centers. Tom Bradley opened it carefully, his experienced eye taking in details that told their own story about the writer's circumstances. Inside, written in pencil on lined paper, was a message that would change everything. "To whoever is helping Hank Miller, my name is Jessica Torres. Emma Rodriguez is my daughter. I saw the news. Story about the homeless man who found her. I've been trying to work up the courage to come forward, but I am scared. I need you to know some things about Emma and about why I left her. Emma's father was Marcus Miller. He died of an overdose 8 months ago. I was with him when he died. Marcus talked about his father all the time, showed me pictures, told me stories. He said his dad was a war hero who got broken by the fighting. He said he wished he could see him again, but was too ashamed. I tried to take care of Emma after Marcus died, but I couldn't. I'm only 17, and I have my own problems. I left her at the hospital, hoping someone would help her, but when I came back, she was gone. I've been looking for her ever since. The man who found her is her grandfather. I know he doesn't know this yet. Marcus never told him about Emma because he thought his father wouldn't want anything to do with us. But Emma needs him, and maybe he needs Emma too. I am writing this because I want what is best for my daughter, even if that means I can't be with her. Hank Miller is Emma's family. He deserves to know the truth. Please tell him I am sorry for everything. Tell him Marcus loved him even if he never said so. Jessica Torres P.S. I left something in Emma's rabbit. Marcus wanted his father to have it. Bradley read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. Emma wasn't just a random child who had formed an attachment to Hank. She was his biological granddaughter, the daughter of the son he'd lost to addiction and despair. He thought about the small stuffed rabbit that Emma carried everywhere, the toy she'd had when Hank found her on the clinic steps. With careful fingers, Bradley examined the worn toy until he found a small opening in the seam. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was another letter, older, more carefully written, and addressed to Dad in handwriting Bradley recognized from military files. The second letter was from Marcus Miller, written to a father he'd never had the courage to contact. Dad, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I don't blame you. I know I was a disappointment. Know I caused you and Mom a lot of pain. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I remember the good times too. I remember you teaching me to throw a baseball. Remember the stories you told me about being a soldier. Remember how proud I was to tell people my dad was a hero. I have a daughter now. Her name is Emma, and she is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I wish you could meet her, but I don't think that's possible. I'm not the man you wanted me to become, and I don't know how to change that. I named her Emma, after your sister who died when you were little. You told me once that Emma was the only person who ever made you feel completely safe. I hope my Emma can do that for someone someday. If something happens to me, I want you to know that I love you. I always loved you, even when I couldn't figure out how to show it. Maybe someday we can sit down and talk without all the anger and hurt between us. Maybe someday I can tell you I'm sorry and mean it in a way that matters. I hope. You find peace, Dad. You deserve it. Your son, Marcus P.S. Emma's middle name is Miller. Just in case. Bradley sat in his office for a long time after reading both letters, understanding that he held in his hands the power to either heal a family or destroy whatever fragile hope Hank had built around his relationship with Emma. The decision of when and how to reveal this information would affect 3 generations. A grandfather who didn't know he had a granddaughter, a child who didn't know she had found her family, and a teenage mother who had made the ultimate sacrifice by giving up her daughter to give her a better life. Detective Santos was conducting her own investigation into Jessica Torres when Bradley called to request a meeting. The detective had been close to locating the teen, following leads through the network of shelters, soup kitchens, and abandoned buildings where homeless youth survived on the margins of society. I need to show you something, Bradley said when they met at a coffee shop downtown. He handed over both letters, watching Santos's expression change as she read them. Jesus, she breathed. Emma is his granddaughter, and Marcus Miller was her father. The son, Hank, lost to overdose. Santos was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. This changes everything. If these letters are authentic, if we can locate Jessica Torres to verify they're authentic, Bradley said with certainty. The handwriting matches samples from Marcus Miller's military recruitment paperwork, and Jessica Torres has been trying to contact social services through intermediaries. She wants to do right by her daughter, but she's terrified of losing her completely. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we arrange a meeting. Jessica Torres, Patricia Williams from social services, you, me, and Hank. Let the truth come. Out in a controlled environment where everyone can make decisions based on facts rather than assumptions. It took another week to arrange the meeting. Another week of Emma continuing to thrive during her visits with Hank while living in foster care that felt more temporary with each passing day. The Hendersons were good people, but they had begun to understand that they were caring for a child whose heart belonged somewhere else. The meeting took place in the same conference room where Hank and Emma had their supervised visits. Jessica Torres arrived early, accompanied by a legal advocate from the Youth Rights Project. She was smaller than expected, younger looking than her 17 years, with the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who had survived more trauma than most adults. When Hank entered the room, Jessica's reaction was immediate and emotional. She began crying, not the tears of guilt or fear, but the tears of someone who had carried an enormous burden alone and was finally able to share it. You look just like him, she whispered, just like Marcus when he talked about you. Hank studied her face, seeing echoes of his son in her features, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to her chin. "You're Emma's mother." "Yes, and Marcus was her father. Your son was her father." The words hung in the air like a revelation that was both shocking and inevitable. Hank felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. He had known on some level that his connection to Emma was more than circumstantial. The heart recognizes blood even when the mind hasn't caught up. Patricia Williams opened Jessica's file and began reading from the letters that had brought them all together. As the truth unfolded, Marcus's love for his father, his shame about his life, his hope for his daughter's future, Hank felt 15 years of grief and regret begin to transform into something else entirely. Emma wasn't just a child he had saved. She was his family, his second chance, his son's final gift to a world that had taken so much from them both. The DNA test results arrived on a grey Thursday morning that would forever divide Hank's life into before and after. Patricia Williams opened the manila envelope with the careful precision of someone who had learned that official documents could change lives in an instant. Probability of paternal relationship, 99.97%, she read aloud to the assembled group. Hank, Jessica Torres, Detective Santos, Tom Bradley, and Dr. Chen. The conference room felt smaller with the weight of this confirmation, the scientific proof of what everyone had begun to suspect but hadn't dared to fully believe. Emma Rodriguez Miller was indeed the biological granddaughter of Henry Miller. The child he had found freezing on clinic steps was the daughter of the son he had mourned for 3 years, the son he believed had died hating him. Hank stared at the document as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less overwhelming. His hands trembled, the same hands that had remained steady under enemy fire, that had pulled wounded soldiers to safety, that had learned to navigate a wheelchair with military precision. Now they shook like leaves in a storm. "Grandpa," he whispered, trying the word on for size. It felt foreign and familiar simultaneously, like a language he had once spoken fluently but hadn't used in years. Jessica Torres watched his face with the intensity of someone whose own future hung in the balance of his reaction. At 17, she had made impossible decisions based on love and desperation, giving up her daughter in hope of giving her a better life. Now she was watching that hope take the form of a broken man who was learning he wasn't as broken as he'd believed. "Tell me about Marcus," Hank said, his voice barely audible. "Tell me about my son in the end." The question opened floodgates of memory and grief that Jessica had been holding back for months. She began to speak in a rush, as if the words had been building pressure inside her chest. He was trying to get clean when Emma was born. He got a job at a construction site. Nothing fancy, but he was so proud of that paycheck. He would buy diapers and formula and these tiny little clothes, and he would hold Emma for hours, just staring at her face like he couldn't believe she was real. Her voice cracked, but she continued. "He had pictures of you in his wallet, old ones from when he was a kid. You in uniform, you teaching him to ride a bike, you at his Little League games. He would show them to Emma and tell her stories about her grandfather, the war hero." Hank closed his eyes, remembering those Little League games. The pride on Marcus's face when he connected with a pitch, the way his son had looked for him in the stands after every play. Somewhere along the way, that bright, eager boy had gotten lost, replaced by an angry teenager who saw his father's trauma as rejection, his mother's departure as abandonment. "He wanted to call you," Jessica continued. "After Emma was born, he talked about it all the time. He had your number, got it from some veteran friend who knew where you were staying. But he was scared you wouldn't want to see him, scared you'd be ashamed of what he'd become." The cruel irony wasn't lost on any of them. Father and son, both broken by war and its aftermath, both too proud and too afraid to reach across the silence that had grown between them. Marcus had died believing his father didn't love him, while Hank had mourned believing his son didn't care. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing the emotional devastation and reconstruction happening in front of Her spoke with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "Emma needs to know," she said. "Not everything, not all at once, but she needs to understand that the man she's attached to is actually her family. Children her age don't understand complex relationships, but they understand love and belonging." Patricia Williams was already calculating the legal implications. A biological relationship changed everything about Emma's case. Custody considerations, placement options, the rights and responsibilities of all parties involved. But it also complicated everything because family relationships didn't automatically guarantee appropriate care. "Mr. Miller," she said carefully, "I need to ask some difficult questions. Finding out Emma is your granddaughter doesn't automatically qualify you for custody. You're still homeless, still dealing with PTSD and disability. The court's primary concern will be Emma's best interests, not biological relationships." The words were a cold splash of reality that brought Hank back to practical considerations. Being Emma's grandfather didn't magically solve the problems that had led to his homelessness, didn't erase the years of trauma and failed relationships, didn't make him automatically capable of raising a 3-year-old who had already experienced significant neglect and abandonment. But Tom Bradley had been waiting for this moment, had been preparing for the conversation that would determine whether this remarkable reunion would result in a family restored or another tragedy of good intentions, undermined by harsh realities. "We've been working on that," Bradley said, producing a folder thick with paperwork. "Hank's been accepted into the rapid rehousing program for veterans. He starts receiving housing assistance next month, which comes with a 2-bedroom apartment. He's also been enrolled in VA counseling services and disability benefits he should have been receiving all along." He spread documents across the conference table. Applications, approvals, benefit determinations, medical evaluations. The American Legion has offered him a part-time job doing outreach to homeless veterans. It's not much money, but it's steady income, and it uses his experience to help other people in similar situations. Detective Santos added her perspective. "Mr. Miller has been completely cooperative throughout this investigation. No criminal history, no substance abuse issues, no complaints from social service providers or shelter staff. His homelessness appears to be a result of untreated PTSD and failure to access available benefits, not any character defects or dangerous behaviors." The room fell quiet as everyone processed the transformation that was taking place in real time. The homeless man who had found a freezing child on clinic steps was revealing himself to be a decorated veteran, a grieving father, and now a grandfather who had unknowingly saved his own family. But perhaps the most important voice in the room belonged to Jessica Torres, who had initiated this revelation by choosing to tell the truth despite the personal cost. "I want what's best for Emma," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of adult responsibility. "I love her more than anything, but I can't take care of her. I'm 17, I don't have a home, I'm still figuring out how to take care of myself." "But Hank," she looked directly at him, "Marcus always said you were the strongest man he knew, even when you were broken. He said you taught him that being scared doesn't make you weak, and being weak doesn't make you worthless." She reached into her backpack and pulled out another photograph. Marcus holding infant Emma, both of them smiling at the camera. He wanted her to know her grandfather. He just ran out of time to make it happen. Hank took the photograph with shaking hands, seeing his son's face overlaid with memories of the boy he had been, the man he might have become if war and trauma hadn't derailed his life. But he also saw something else in the picture. Joy, hope, the possibility of redemption that comes with new life. Emma wasn't just his granddaughter. She was his second chance, his opportunity to be the father to her that he had failed to be. To Marcus, she was proof that love could survive the worst circumstances, that families could be rebuilt from the most broken pieces. The DNA test had confirmed their biological relationship, But everyone in that room understood that the bonds between them went far deeper than genetics. They had found each other when they both needed saving, had chosen each other before they knew they were family. Now they had to convince a court system designed to protect children from unsuitable guardians that sometimes the most unlikely person could be exactly what a child needed. They had to prove that a homeless veteran could become a capable grandfather, that a broken man could build a stable home, that love really could conquer the practical obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The fight for Emma was just beginning. But for the first time in 15 years, Hank Miller had something worth fighting for that was even more important than his own survival. The journal had been Marcus's most private possession, hidden in a storage locker that Jessica had kept paying for with money earned from odd jobs and occasional panhandling. She had never read it while Marcus was alive, respecting his need for privacy, even when drugs made him paranoid and secretive about everything else. But after his death, after Emma's birth, during the long nights when she held her daughter and wondered what kind of future she could possibly provide, Jessica had finally opened the worn notebook. What she found inside had ultimately led her to make the most difficult decision of her young life. Now, sitting in the apartment that Warriors Haven had helped Hank secure, she handed him the journal with the solemnity of someone passing on. "Sacred scripture. He wrote about you almost every day," she said quietly, especially near the end, when he was trying to get clean for Emma. Hank's new apartment was small but clean, a one-bedroom unit in a building that housed other veterans, transitioning from homelessness to stability. The furniture was donated, mismatched but functional, and the walls were bare except for the framed photograph of Marcus holding Emma that now sat on the kitchen table like a shrine to possibilities that had been lost and found again. The journal's pages were filled with Marcus's handwriting, sometimes steady and careful, other times shaky and erratic, depending on his condition when he wrote. But the content was consistently focused on two subjects, his daughter and his father. Day 127. Emma smiled at me today. Really smiled, not gas or whatever the baby books say. She looked right at me and smiled like she knew I was her dad. I wish my father could see her. I wish I could call him and say, "Dad, you're a grandfather," and have him be happy about it, instead of ashamed. Day 143, got fired again. Showed up late too many times, couldn't keep my hands steady enough to operate the equipment safely. Emma needs diapers, and I spent the money on pills instead. I'm becoming everything my father probably feared I would become when he looked at me with that disappointed expression. But I can't seem to stop. Day 156, Jessica says Emma's first word was "Dada." I cried for an hour. I want to be better for her. I want to be the kind of man my father was before the war broke him. He used to be so strong, so sure of everything. I remember feeling completely safe when he was around, like nothing bad could happen as long as he was there. Day 178, found Dad's old Purple Heart in Mom's basement when I went to get Emma's clothes. Mom said I could keep it. She said Dad earned it saving his squad from an IED. I never knew the details before. He never talked about what happened over there, just came home different and angry all the time. But reading the citation, he carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. He was a hero, and I never told him I was proud of him. Page after page revealed the internal struggle of a young man who loved his father, but couldn't bridge the gap that trauma had created between them. Marcus had inherited Hank's sense of duty and honor, but also his tendency to internalize pain, to protect others by pushing them away when the darkness became too overwhelming. Day 203. Emma is walking now. She takes these careful little steps, like she's not sure the ground will hold her weight. Reminds me of Dad learning to use his wheelchair, that same careful determination. I wonder if courage is genetic, if Emma got some of his strength along with his eyes. Day 221. Overdosed yesterday. Jessica called 911 and they pumped my stomach. Emma was in her crib the whole time, probably crying and no one hearing her because I was unconscious on the bathroom floor. I could have died and left her alone. I could have become another statistic, and Emma could have ended up in the system like Jessica did. This has to stop. Day 234, 37 days clean. Went to a meeting today and talked about my father for the first time. Told them about the war, about how he came home broken, about how I blamed him for everything that went wrong in our family. The sponsor asked me if I ever considered that maybe Dad was doing the best he could with what he had left after the fighting. Maybe his anger wasn't about not loving us. Maybe it was about loving us too much and not knowing how to protect us from what was inside his head. Day 247. If something happens to me, I want Emma to know about her grandfather, not the broken man who came home from Afghanistan, but the hero who saved his squad, the man who taught me to throw a baseball and read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. The man who cried when he missed my Little League games because he was in the VA hospital again. Day 251, last entry. I can feel myself slipping again. The cravings are getting stronger and Jessica is scared. She should be. I'm scared too. But I wrote a letter to Dad today. Told him about Emma, told him I love him, told him I'm sorry for being such a disappointment. I don't think I'll mail it, but writing it felt important. Maybe someday Emma will understand that her father and grandfather loved each other even when we were too broken to figure out how to show it. The journal ended there, 3 days before Marcus's fatal overdose. Hank read through it twice, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't shed since the day he'd learned of his son's death. The words painted a picture of a young man desperate to break generational cycles of trauma, fighting addiction with the same courage his father had shown in combat. Tom Bradley found Hank sitting at his kitchen table hours later, the journal open in front of him, the apartment dark except for the single lamp that cast shadows across the handwritten pages. "You okay?" Bradley asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "He knew," Hank said without looking up. "He knew I loved him, even at the end. I thought he died hating me for all the ways I failed him. Trauma makes us stupid sometimes," Bradley observed, settling into the other kitchen chair. "Makes us think our pain is the only pain that matters. Makes us forget that other people are fighting their own battles." They sat in comfortable silence, two veterans who understood that some grief was too deep for words, that some regrets could only be processed through time and acceptance. "The custody hearing is next week," Bradley said eventually. Hank nodded. Patricia Williams had filed the necessary paperwork, requesting that the court consider placing Emma with her biological grandfather, rather than continuing with traditional foster care placement. The judge would weigh Hank's military service and newfound stability against his recent homelessness and ongoing mental health challenges. "Are you ready for it?" "I don't know," Hank admitted. "I've been clean and sober for 8 years. I've got stable housing now. I'm getting the help I should have gotten years ago. But am I ready to raise a 3-year-old who's already been through trauma? Am I ready to be responsible for someone else's life when I barely figured out how to be responsible for my own?" Bradley smiled, recognizing the self-awareness that had been absent from Hank's thinking when they first met. "The fact that you're asking those questions suggests you might be readier than you think. Bad parents don't worry about being bad parents." Over. The following days, an unlikely support network assembled around Hank and Emma. Dr. Chen provided medical testimony about the therapeutic value of their relationship. Detective Santos wrote a character reference noting Hank's cooperation and integrity throughout the investigation. Veterans from Warriors Haven volunteered to serve as witnesses to his transformation from homeless survivor to stable community member. Jessica Torres, despite her youth and legal vulnerability, requested permission to testify on Hank's behalf. Her lawyer advised against it. Testifying in court would expose her to potential criminal charges for child endangerment and abandonment. But she insisted, saying Emma deserved to have someone speak for what Marcus would have wanted, The most unexpected support came from the Hendersons, Emma's foster parents, who had observed her behavior during transition visits to Hank's apartment. "She's not the same child when she's with him," Mrs. Henderson told Patricia Williams during the pre-trial interview. "She's more relaxed, more verbal, more willing to engage with new situations. We've fostered 43 children over the years, and we've never seen attachment this healthy or this beneficial to a child's development." Emma herself, though too young to understand the legal proceedings, had begun calling Hank Grandpa, with the casual certainty of someone who had never doubted where she belonged. During their supervised visits, she would climb onto his lap and announce to anyone within hearing distance that Grandpa Hank was her family, settling the matter in her own mind if nowhere else. The night before the hearing, Hank sat in his apartment reading Marcus's journal one final time. The words had become familiar, but their impact hadn't diminished. His son had died hoping for reconciliation, believing in the possibility of healing, trusting that Emma would somehow connect the broken pieces of their family. Now it was up to a judge to decide whether that hope had been justified, whether love really could overcome the practical obstacles that seemed to stand between a grandfather and the granddaughter he had saved without knowing she was his to save. Tomorrow would determine whether Emma Rodriguez Miller would grow up, knowing her family history, understanding that she came from a line of imperfect people who had nevertheless tried to do right by each other when it mattered most. Tomorrow would decide whether second chances were real, or just another cruel illusion designed to make broken people believe in possibilities that didn't exist. Judge Catherine Martinez had been presiding over family court for 12 years, long enough to develop both profound compassion for broken families and healthy skepticism about unconventional solutions to complex problems. The case file spread across her desk that Monday morning represented exactly the kind of situation that made her job simultaneously rewarding and impossible. On one side, Henry Miller, a decorated combat veteran whose service record was exemplary and whose recent transformation from homeless to housed was impressive but untested. On the other side, the weight of institutional wisdom that suggested homeless individuals, regardless of their military service or family relationships, might not be suitable guardians for traumatized children. The courtroom was fuller than usual. For a custody hearing, Warriors Haven had mobilized a contingent of veterans to support Hank, while child welfare advocates filled the opposite side of the gallery. Media attention had been carefully controlled, no cameras, no recording devices, but the presence of reporters added weight to proceedings that would normally occur without public scrutiny. Patricia Williams presented the state's position with the careful neutrality required by her role. Social services neither supported nor opposed Miller's custody petition. Instead, they laid out facts and allowed the court to interpret their significance. Mr. Miller has demonstrated remarkable progress in the 3 months since Emma was found. Williams testified. He has secured stable housing, enrolled in counseling services, and begun receiving disability benefits that should have been available to him years earlier. His relationship with Emma appears genuinely therapeutic for both parties. She paused, consulting her notes. However, the court must consider that Mr. Miller's stability is recent and untested. He has no experience raising young children, no support network beyond the veterans community, and ongoing mental health challenges related to combat trauma. Emma has already experienced significant abandonment and neglect. The court must weigh whether placing her with another, potentially vulnerable adult serves her best interests. The state's child welfare expert, Dr. Robert Harrison, provided clinical perspective that was both supportive and cautionary. His testimony reflected the complex reality that attachment and love, while crucial for child development, weren't always sufficient to ensure appropriate care. Emma's attachment to Mr. Miller is genuine and appears beneficial to her emotional development. Dr. Harrison explained. However, attachment can form quickly between traumatized children and any adult who shows them consistent kindness. The question for the court is whether this specific relationship provides the stability and resources necessary for long-term child welfare. The defense began with Hank's military records, establishing a foundation of service and sacrifice that would be difficult for anyone to question. Tom Bradley had helped prepare the presentation, understanding that judges responded to concrete achievements and measurable progress. Hank's disability discharge papers told the story of his military service in stark official language. Staff Sergeant Henry Miller, 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, recipient of 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for valor. The citation for his Bronze Star was read aloud. For heroic achievement in connection with combat operations against an armed enemy, Staff Sergeant Miller, with complete disregard for his personal safety, repeatedly exposed himself to intense enemy fire to evacuate wounded personnel from an ambush site. His courageous actions under fire saved the lives of 3 soldiers and exemplified the highest traditions of military service. Judge Martinez listened to these recitations with the respect they deserved, but her expression remained carefully neutral. Military heroism was admirable, but it didn't automatically translate to parenting capability, a fact that too many family courts had learned through bitter experience. Dr. Chen took the witness stand next, bringing medical authority to bear on the question of Emma's welfare. Her testimony was measured but compelling, describing the remarkable progress Emma had made during her relationship with Hank. When Emma first arrived at our clinic, she was nearly catatonic, Dr. Chen explained. Severe hypothermia, signs of prolonged neglect, minimal verbal communication. She exhibited the kind of withdrawal we typically see in children who have learned that adults cannot be trusted to meet their basic needs. She referenced Emma's medical chart, documenting the child's transformation over the past 3 months. Since beginning regular contact with Mr. Miller, Emma has gained 8 pounds. Her vocabulary has expanded significantly, and she demonstrates age-appropriate social behaviors. Most importantly, she shows genuine joy, something that was completely absent when we first treated her. The prosecutor, representing the state's interest in child protection, cross-examined Dr. Chen with questions designed to establish the limitations of her observations. Doctor, you've observed Emma during supervised visits in controlled environments. Can you testify to Mr. Miller's capability to handle the daily stresses of full-time parenting, sleep deprivation, behavioral problems, medical emergencies? Dr. Chen acknowledged the limitation while defending her conclusions. I cannot predict future behavior based on present observations. However, I can testify that Mr. Miller has consistently responded to Emma's needs with patience, attention, and appropriate boundaries. He demonstrates understanding of child development and realistic expectations for a 3-year-old who has experienced trauma. Detective Santos provided law enforcement perspective, her testimony carrying particular weight because of her role in the original investigation. She had interviewed Hank multiple times, observed him under stress, and evaluated his credibility. When child safety was at stake, Mr. Miller has been completely forthright throughout this investigation, Santos testified. His account of finding Emma has been consistent. His cooperation has been exemplary, and his concern for the child's welfare has been genuine from the first moment I met him. She paused, choosing her words carefully. In 15 years of police work, I've learned to distinguish between people who help children because they want recognition and people who help because they can't do otherwise. Mr. Miller falls into the second category. The morning session concluded with testimony from the Hendersons, Emma's foster parents, whose perspective carried special significance because they had no vested interest in the outcome beyond Emma's welfare. Mrs. Henderson's voice was gentle, but firm as she described Emma's behavior during transition visits to Hank's apartment. Emma is a different child, when she's with her grandfather. She's more confident, more verbal, more willing to try new things. We've fostered many children, Your Honor, and we recognize the difference between temporary attachment and genuine family bonding." Her husband nodded agreement. "Emma talks about Grandpa Hank constantly. She draws pictures of him, asks when she's going to see him next, includes him in her prayers at bedtime. This isn't a child who's confused about relationships. This is a child who knows where she belongs." Judge Martinez called for a lunch recess, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts on the testimony presented. The afternoon session would bring the most crucial voices: Jessica Torres, who had initiated this revelation by choosing truth over self-protection, and Hank himself, who would need to convince the court that his love for Emma was matched by his capability to provide the stability she desperately needed. The courtroom emptied slowly, supporters and observers understanding that they had witnessed only the opening movements of a legal symphony that would determine whether a broken family could be made whole again or whether institutional caution would prevail over the possibility of redemption. Jessica Torres entered the courtroom that afternoon with the careful composure of someone who had spent her 17 years learning to navigate systems designed by adults who had never lived her reality. Her testimony carried risks: admission of child abandonment, potential criminal charges, the possibility of losing any future contact with her daughter. But she had made her choice based on love rather than self-preservation, understanding that Emma's future mattered more than her own legal jeopardy. "Miss Torres," the prosecutor began, "you abandoned your 3-year-old daughter at a hospital, and she nearly died of exposure. Why should this court consider your opinion about her appropriate placement?" The question was harsh, but not unexpected. Jessica's lawyer had prepared her for attacks on her credibility and character, warning that the state would use her past mistakes to undermine her testimony. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without family," Jessica replied, her young voice steady. "I aged out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go and no one who cared what happened to me. I don't want that for Emma. She has family now, real family who loves her." She looked directly at Judge Martinez. "I made a terrible mistake, leaving Emma at the hospital. I was 17, scared, homeless, and I couldn't figure out how to take care of her properly. But I knew she deserved better than I could give her. When I saw the news story about the man who found her, when I realized who he was, I knew Marcus had been right about his father all along." The defense attorney, provided by the Veterans Legal Aid Society, guided Jessica through the story of Marcus's final months, his attempts at sobriety, his love for Emma, his regret about the estrangement from his father. Marcus carried guilt about disappointing his dad, Jessica explained. He'd tell Emma stories about her grandfather, show her pictures, talk about wanting to call him, but being afraid he wouldn't want anything to do with us. He died thinking his father was ashamed of him, but he never stopped loving him. Judge Martinez leaned forward slightly. "Miss Torres, you could face criminal charges for abandoning Emma. Your testimony here today could be used against you in future proceedings. Do you understand that?" "Yes, ma'am. But Emma needs to know her family. She needs to know she comes from people who serve their country, who protect others even when it costs them everything. Mr. Miller is her grandfather, and he's the best chance she has for a real family." The courtroom was quiet as Jessica left the witness stand, her courage in testifying, despite personal risk, having made its own argument for the transformative power of putting love before self-interest. Then it was Hank's turn. He approached the witness stand in his wheelchair with military bearing, wearing the one good shirt Tom Bradley had helped him buy for the hearing. The transformation from the homeless man who had found Emma 4 months earlier was remarkable. Not just in appearance, but in the quiet confidence that came from having purpose again. The defense attorney established the foundation of Hank's transformation: stable housing, regular counseling, financial stability through disability benefits, and part-time employment. But the real test came when the prosecutor cross-examined him about his fitness to raise a traumatized child. "Mr. Miller, you've been homeless for several years. You struggle with PTSD and depression. You have no experience raising young children. What makes you think you're qualified to parent a 3-year-old who has already experienced significant trauma?" Hank was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoroughness it deserved. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "You're right that I've been homeless," he began. "You're right that I struggle with PTSD, probably will for the rest of my life. You're right that I don't have experience with small children. But I know what it's like to be abandoned by the systems that are supposed to protect you. I know what it's like to be invisible, to have people look right through you like you don't exist." He paused, looking toward the gallery where Emma sat, with Mrs. Henderson coloring quietly in a notebook. "That little girl looked at me and saw someone worth trusting when everyone else saw a threat. She chose me before either of us knew we were family. I don't know if I'll be a perfect grandfather, probably won't be, but I know I'll never give up on her the way I gave up on myself. I know I'll fight for her the way I should have fought. For my son." His voice strengthened. "Emma needs someone who understands what it means to be broken and find your way back. She needs someone who won't abandon her when things get difficult, because I know what abandonment does to a person. Most of all, she needs to know she matters to someone, that she's not just another case file or placement decision." Judge Martinez had been taking notes throughout his testimony, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller, if I grant you custody of Emma, what assurances can you give this court that you'll provide the stability she needs?" "I can't promise I'll never have bad days, Your Honor, but I can promise that my bad days will never be more important than her good days. I can promise that she'll never wonder if she's loved, never feel invisible, never be forgotten. And I can promise that she'll grow up knowing her father was a good man who made mistakes, but who loved her enough to make sure she found her way to family." The courtroom held its breath as Judge Martinez prepared to render her decision, a choice that would echo through generations, determining whether second chances were real or just another dream deferred by the harsh realities of institutional caution. 6 months after Judge Martinez granted Hank Miller guardianship of his granddaughter, the small apartment that had once felt temporary now hummed with the comfortable chaos of family life. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, her toys occupied. Strategic positions throughout the living room, and the sound of her laughter had replaced the silence that had defined Hank's existence for so many years. The key to their new apartment, a 2-bedroom unit in a building specifically designated for veterans with families, hung on a hook by the front door. It was more than a piece of metal. It was proof that broken people could rebuild their lives, that love really could create stability from the most unstable circumstances. Emma had blossomed under Hank's care in ways that surpassed even Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections. Her vocabulary had expanded exponentially. Her nightmares had decreased in frequency and intensity, and she had developed the kind of secure attachment that child development experts considered the foundation for lifelong emotional health. "Grandpa, tell me the story about Daddy again," she requested from her position on Hank's lap, a nightly ritual that had evolved from Hank's need to keep Marcus's memory alive and Emma's need to understand her place in their family's complicated history. Hank had learned to tell these stories carefully, editing out details that were inappropriate for a 4-year-old, while preserving the essential truth that her father had loved her deeply and wanted the best for her future. "Your daddy was brave like a soldier," Hank began, using the simplified narrative that had become familiar to both of them. "He had to go away before you were big enough to remember him, but he made sure you would find your way to people who love you." Emma nodded with the serious attention she always gave to stories about Marcus, processing information that would take years for her to fully understand, but already grasping the central message. She was loved, she belonged, she mattered. Dr. Chen visited regularly, ostensibly for medical checkups, but really to witness the remarkable transformation that had occurred in both grandfather and granddaughter. During her most recent visit, she had marveled at the domestic scene that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. "She's reading at her kindergarten level," Dr. Chen reported, watching Emma sound out words in a picture book. "Her social development is completely age-appropriate now, and she's showing resilience that suggests her early trauma won't define her future." But perhaps more remarkable was Hank's own transformation. The hollow-eyed man who had sat outside the clinic seeking only warmth had been replaced by someone with purpose, direction, and hope. He had enrolled in community college courses on child development, joined a support group for grandparents raising grandchildren, and begun volunteering at Warriors Haven to help other homeless veterans navigate the systems he had learned to. "Master, having Emma gave me back my life," he told Tom Bradley during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "But maybe more important, it gave me back my son. I understand Marcus now in ways I couldn't when he was alive. The fear, the shame, the feeling that you're disappointing everyone who loves you. If I can help Emma avoid those feelings, maybe I can finally do right by both of them." Jessica Torres remained part of their extended family, visiting monthly under an arrangement that prioritized Emma's needs while acknowledging Jessica's continued love for her daughter. At 19 now, Jessica was enrolled in community college and living in transitional housing for young adults, aging out of foster care. The criminal charges for child abandonment had been reduced to community service and mandatory parenting classes, a recognition that her decision to leave Emma where she would be found had ultimately led to the best possible outcome. "You did the right thing," Hank told her during one of these visits, watching Emma play with the other children at the park where they often met. "It took courage to put Emma's needs ahead of your own fears." Jessica smiled, seeing in Emma the confident, happy child she had dreamed her daughter could become, but hadn't known how to nurture. "Marcus would be proud of both of you," she said. "He always said his dad was a hero, even when things were bad between them." The media attention had eventually faded, but the story of the homeless veteran and the abandoned child had inspired concrete changes in how veterans' services and child welfare systems coordinated their efforts. Warriors Haven had received federal funding to expand their rapid rehousing program, and several other cities had implemented similar initiatives based on Hank and Emma's case. Detective Santos, who had maintained contact with the family, often reflected on how the investigation had challenged her assumptions about appropriate parenting and suitable guardians. "Sometimes the most unlikely people turn out to be exactly what a child needs," she told colleagues when discussing the case. "Our job is to protect children, but that doesn't always mean protecting them from unconventional families." On Emma's 4th birthday, Hank organized a small party in their apartment, Emma's first real birthday celebration with family who would remember it for years to come. The guest list was small but meaningful. Dr. Chen and her husband, Tom Bradley, and his wife, the Hendersons, who remained like honorary grandparents, Jessica Torres, and several other veteran families from their building. As Emma blew out the candles on her cake, making wishes she was too young to articulate but old enough to believe could come true, Hank felt the kind of profound gratitude that had nothing to do with receiving and everything to do with being trusted to give. Later that evening, as he tucked Emma into her bed, her very own bed in her very own room, she looked up at him with the dark eyes she had inherited from Marcus and made an announcement that stopped his heart. "I love you, Grandpa Hank," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had never doubted where she belonged. "You're the best grandpa in the whole world." Hank kissed her forehead, turned on her nightlight, and quietly closed the door to her room. In the hallway, he paused to look at the framed photograph of Marcus holding infant Emma, the picture that had become the centerpiece of their home. proof that love could survive the worst circumstances and find its way to the people who needed it most. Sometimes the most broken people really did have the biggest hearts. Sometimes those society overlooked were the ones who saw the most clearly. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the family you thought you had lost forever could find its way back to you in the most unexpected ways. The man who had once been invisible had become essential. The child who had been abandoned had found her way home, and the love that had seemed impossible had proven to be the most natural thing in the world.